Good afternoon, everyone. Yes, we have started with this particular topic, that is diuretics, and it is our third lecture. So, in first lecture, we have studied about the renal physiology. We have studied different transporters which cause the reabsorption of sodium into the interstitial species. In second lecture, we have started with the point, or we have finished with the first category of drugs under diuretics, that is the loop diuretics, which are a high efficacy diuretics, or in other ways it is called as the ceiling effect diuretics. Okay, so out of all the diuretics, the loop diuretics are the very important types of diuretics, as they cause significant diuresis when we compare with that of the other diuretics. Okay, so let's move forward to the next type, uh, that is the thiazide diuretics. Okay, we will try to finish this topic today itself, and so let's just start. I will just select the pen. Okay, so pen is selected. So chlorothiazide was the first orally active thiazide, although hydrochlorothiazide and chlorthalidone are now used more commonly due to their better bioavailability. So examples of this thiazide, as we can see, there are three examples given over here, that is chlorothiazide, then hydrochlorothiazide, and third one is chlorthalidone. Okay, so please see the spelling of these drugs. If you write wrong spelling, then you won't get marks for it. Okay, so writing correct spellings, it is very much important when you are writing any classification. So hydrochlorothiazide, it is more potent, so the required dose is lower when compared with that of the chlorothiazide. Okay, but the efficacy is comparable to that of the parent drug. Okay, so if we consider the efficacy, then hydrochlorothiazide and chlorothiazide, it is same or similar, but the potency, if we consider, hydrochlorothiazide has more potency when compared to that of chlorothiazide. Potency means what? It is the amount in which the drug is required to produce a certain effect. Okay, so or a certain degree of effect. Okay, so if we consider, if we want 100% effect, then the hydrochlorothiazide, the quantity of it is required less when we compare it with that of the chlorothiazide. Okay, so the chlorthalidone, it is approximately twice as potent as hydrochlorothiazide. So in all other aspects, hydrochlorothiazide resembles chlorothiazide. So if we have to arrange these drugs potency wise, then we have to put chlorthalidone as the first one. Okay, so as it is as approximately twice as potent as hydrochlorothiazide, so I have shown these two signs. So in between we have the hydrochlorothiazide, and lastly we have the chlorothiazide. Okay, so what is the meaning of this particular chart is that chlorthalidone is the most potent drug and the chlorothiazide is the least potent drug, but rest of the characteristic, like that of the efficacy, they are the same, but it is only the dose of chlorthalidone is least required, and to produce the same amount of response we require more amount of drug of the chlorothiazide. Okay, so mechanism of action. So the thiazide and thiazide like diuretics, they act mainly in the distal convoluted tubule. So this is the site of action of the thiazide diuretics. So if you can remember that particular chart which we have studied earlier on, this one, So you can connect this chart with that. Okay, so you can see in distal convoluted tubule the thiazides, they act or they produce their diuretic action. Okay, so their site of action is TCT. Okay, so let's go back to the original slide. So when it acts on distal convoluted tubule, it decreases the reabsorption of the sodium by inhibition of sodium chloride co-transporter. So if we have to summarize the mech of action of the thiazide diuretics, it is one line mech of action, that it acts in the distal convoluted tubule and it inhibits the sodium chloride co-transporter. Okay, so as it inhibits the sodium chloride co-transporter, this drug increases concentration of sodium and chloride in the tubular fluid. Simple. If this transporter is inhibited, this is the lumen, uh, in which the sodium and chloride are present, and this is the transporter which carries this sodium and chloride across the cell to the interstitium, that is into the blood. Okay, so if the thiazide diuretics, they are inhibiting this particular transporter, then this sodium and chloride has no other way to go over here, that is into the interstitium. It can follow only this. Okay, so as this transporter is blocked, this sodium and chloride, it stays within the lumen. Okay, so thiazides must be excreted into the tubular lumen at the proximal convoluted tubule to be effective. Okay, so for producing the action, the thiazides, they must be present in the tubular lumen, and where it should enter into the tubular lumen, in the PCT. Okay, so if any problem is there, if any abnormality is there in its excretion into the tubule, then these thiazides have no effect or very weak diuretic effect. Okay, so the thiazides must be excreted into the tubular lumen at the PCT to be effective, and therefore decreasing the renal function reduces the diuretic effect. So if there is a problem, or if there is any kidney disorder, then it can lead to the reduction in the diuretic effect of the thiazide diuretics. Okay, so actions of the thiazide diuretics, the first action is the increased excretion of the sodium and chloride. Okay, so the thiazide and thiazide like diuretics, they cause diuresis with increased sodium and chloride excretion, but obvious, as it blocks the sodium and chloride transporter, it results into the excretion of very hyperosmolar urine. Okay, so why we have to call it as a hyperosmolar urine? Because osmolarity, it depends on what? It depends on the amount of electrolytes which is present in the fluid. So if it is causing the sodium and chloride to stay into the tubular liquid, the tubular liquid osmolarity will certainly is going to increase, and this increase in the osmolarity results in formation of concentrated urine. So this latter effect is unique, as other diuretic classes are unlikely to produce hyperosmolar urine. So when compared with the other diuretic classes, this becomes an exception to that of the thiazide diuretics. Okay, so next action of the thiazide diuretic, that is decrease urinary calcium excretion. So thiazide and thiazide like diuretics, they decrease the calcium content of the urine by promoting the reabsorption of the calcium in the distal convoluted tubule, where parathyroid hormone regulates its reabsorption. Okay, so simple, straightforward. You have already studied about the functions of the parathyroid hormone and its site of action, so no need to discuss more about this. Okay, so reduced peripheral vascular resistance is the next action of the thiazide diuretics. So an initial reduction in blood pressure, which results from decrease in blood volume, and therefore a decrease in the cardiac output. Okay, so with continued therapy, the blood volume it returns to the baseline. Okay, so however, antihypertensive effect it continues, which results from reduced peripheral vascular resistance caused by relaxation of arteriolar smooth muscle. Okay, so this is very important to remember this particular action, as it reduces the peripheral vascular resistance. So clinically speaking, when in case of a hypertensive patients, this category of drugs is more commonly used when we compare it with that of the furosemide, or that is loop diuretics. And usually if you go to a medical shop and you try to find out the thiazide diuretic tablets, you will find them to be combined with that of telmisartan. Okay, telmisartan, if you remember, it is angiotensin 2 receptor blocker. Okay, the sartan series. Okay, so you will find telmisartan plus hydrochlorothiazide as a combination drug or combination therapy. Okay, so why we use hydrochlorothiazide, why we don't use loop diuretics? Because additional to the diuretic effect, these particular drugs they also produce the antihypertensive effect. So it is like a synergism, it is seen when we combine this category of drugs with that of the angiotensin 2 receptor blockers. Okay, so synergistic effect, to achieve that synergism we combine these two drugs together. Okay, so the therapeutic uses, main use is the hypertension. Okay, so clinically the thiazides they are the mainstay of the antihypertensive treatment, because they are inexpensive, convenient to administer, and they are well tolerated. So blood pressure can be lowered with a daily dose of the thiazide. At doses equipotent to the hydrochlorothiazide, chlorthalidone is considered a preferred option by some clinicians because of its longer half-life, which is 50 to 60 hours. And also there is improved control of blood pressure over the entire day. However, current treatment guidelines for hypertension do not recommend any thiazide preferentially. So it means that even though we have mentioned that first therapeutic use of these drugs as the hypertension, but it is not part of first line treatment. First line treatment is altogether different of the hypertension. But if first line treatment drugs are unable to control the signs and symptoms of the hypertension, then in that case we have to add the diuretic, and the diuretic which we have to add to the treatment is the thiazide diuretic. Okay, because of its many beneficial effects over other diuretic agents. So next use is of heart failure. Okay, so loop diuretics, not thiazide diuretics, they are the diuretics of choice in reducing extracellular volume in heart failure. Although it is mentioned that we have to use this drug in heart failure, but the first line or first preference we have to give to the loop diuretics. However, thiazide diuretics they may be added to the patient who are resistant to loop diuretics with careful monitoring for the hypokalemia. Okay, so all of these drugs they are known to cause the hypokalemia, so we have to monitor the levels of the potassiums of the blood. Okay, while we are utilizing these drugs. Then metolazone is most frequently utilized as an addition to loop diuretics, although there is lack of evidence that it is more effective than other thiazides for this indication when administered at equipotent doses. Okay, so quite straightforward. So next is hypercalciuria. So the thiazides they can be useful in treating idiopathic hypercalciuria. Hypercalciuria means what? There is excess of calcium in the urine. So that is hypercalciuria. and as we have studied in its effects, it causes reabsorption of the calcium. So, but obvious thiazide diuretics, they can be utilized in the hypercalciuria. Okay, and why hypercalciuria? We have to give the drug in this condition because there is problem of formation of kidney stones because of this hypercalciuria. Okay, so the next therapeutic use is in condition like diabetes insipidus. So the thiazides, they have unique ability to produce hyperosmolar urine. Thiazides can be utilized as a treatment for nephrogenic diabetes insipidus. The urine volume of such individuals may drop from 11 liters per day to 3 liters per day when treated with the thiazides. So in order to understand what I just said, you have to understand what is diabetes insipidus. So diabetes insipidus, it is characterized by excess of urine excretion by the patients. Okay, usually what is our volume of excretion of the urine? It is around maximum 2 to 3 liters. Okay, but in case of diabetes insipidus, it is too much. It becomes like 11 liters or more than that, and which is very much problematic because as urination, the 11 liters of water is going out, it becomes the blood volume will also decrease and it will create multiples of problems. So to treat that, we have this kind of drugs, that is thiazide diuretics. Also, although it is a diuretic, but it can be utilized in these cases. Next category of diuretics, that is antidiuretics. Next category of drugs, that is antidiuretics, they are specifically utilized for this particular condition, that is diabetes insipidus. Okay, so pharmacokinetics, as a class, thiazide, they are effective orally with bioavailability of 60% to the 70%. So the chlorothiazide, it has much lower bioavailability, that is 15 to 30%, and is the only thiazide with an intravenous dosage form. Okay, so when it is given orally, it has very less bioavailability, so that's why the potency also suffers because of it, and that's why we have developed intravenous dosage form, so that all the quantity of the chlorothiazide we are putting into the bloodstream. So in that case, the bioavailability is 100%. Okay, so most thiazides, they take 1 to 3 weeks to produce a stable reduction in blood pressure and exhibit a prolonged half-life. So it takes some time to achieve a steady state plasma concentration. Okay, so at that steady state plasma concentration, it produces the optimum effect which is required. Okay, and how much time it takes? It takes around 1 to 3 weeks. Okay, to achieve that steady state concentration. So don't expect that with the use of thiazide diuretics, if you have hypertension today, tomorrow you will have none. It won't happen like that. It will take some time to produce the effect which you want. Okay, so next is indapamide, which differs from the class because it undergoes hepatic metabolism and is excreted in both the urine and the bile. Most thiazides are primarily excreted unchanged in the urine. So the adverse effect, the first one is the hypokalemia. So hypokalemia, what is it? It is decreased potassium levels in the blood, and it is the most frequent problem with the thiazide diet. So because thiazide increases sodium in the filtrate arriving at the distal tubule, more potassium is also exchanged for sodium, which results in continual loss of potassium from the body with prolonged use of these drugs. So thus serum potassium should be measured periodically and more frequently at the beginning of the therapy to monitor for the development of the hypokalemia. Okay, so the potassium supplementation or combination with potassium sparing diuretics, it may be required. So, low sodium diets blunt the potassium depletion caused by the thiazide diuretics. So we can tackle this particular problem in three ways. That is, either we can give the supplements of the potassium, or we can give additional drug with this thiazide diuretic, that is potassium sparing diuretics. And the third option is the dietary option, in which we will stop taking sodium in excess of quantity. We will reduce its concentration in our food. Okay, and why hypokalemia is important? Because if you remember, hypokalemia, it will create problem in the action potential generation and taking the membrane back to its what to say back to its resting membrane potential. Okay, so as you remember, the potassium efflux is responsible for the repolarization. Sorry, not depolarization, it is repolarization. So if outside the cell the potassium concentration is lesser, then potassium efflux will continue, and potassium efflux, if it continues beyond the level of the resting membrane potential, it will cause the hyperpolarization, and thus it will cause depression of the cell. So it will become difficult for to achieve that particular depolarization wave in next term. Okay, so hypomagnesemia, urinary loss of magnesium, it can lead to hypomagnesemia. Then we have hyponatremia. So hyponatremia may develop due to elevation of the ADH, as well as diminished diluting capacity of the kidney and the increased thirst. Then we have hyperuricemia. So uric acid concentration, it will increase in the blood. So the thiazide, they increase serum uric acid by decreasing the amount of acid excreted through competition in the organic acid secretory system. So being insoluble, this uric acid deposits in the joints and may precipitate a gouty attack. So we are talking about the gout or gouty arthritis. Okay, and it can happen in only predisposed individuals. Not everyone is predisposed to the gout. Only certain people, they have this tendency or propensity to undergo the gouty attack. Okay, so therefore thiazide should be used with caution in patients with gout or high levels of the uric acid. Okay, so next is hypovolemia. Hypo means decreased volume of blood. So this hypovolemia, it can cause orthostatic hypotension or lightheadedness. What is orthostatic hypotension? This orthostatic hypotension, it is called as also called as the postural hypotension, and it happens because of the change in the posture. Okay, so when the person changes its posture from sitting or sleeping to suddenly standing up, the person feels light-headed. Okay, so he feels dizziness. Okay, that can happen with these drugs. Okay, so next is hypercalcemia. Thiazides inhibit secretion of the calcium, sometimes leading to the hypercalcemia, which is nothing but the elevated levels of the calcium in the blood. Then we have next, that is hyperglycemia. Therapy with the thiazides can lead to mild elevations in the serum glucose, possibly due to impaired release of the insulin related to the hypokalemia. Okay, so now it is related to each other. So these drugs cause hypokalemia, and this hypokalemia is causing decrease in the insulin release. And as there is decrease in the insulin release, there is decrease or there is elevation in the serum glucose levels. Okay, so the patients with the diabetes, they still benefit from the thiazide therapy, but should monitor glucose to assess the need for the adjustment in diabetes therapy if thiazides are initiated. Okay, So next category of agents, that is potassium sparing diuretics, and these are weak type of diuretics. Okay, so potassium sparing diuretics, they act in collecting tubule. So what is its site of action? It is collecting tubule, and what they do, they inhibit sodium reabsorption and potassium excretion. Okay, so that's why they are called as the potassium sparing diuretics, as they prevent potassium excretion into the tubular fluid. So potassium levels, they must be monitored in patients who are treated with the potassium sparing diuretics. So these drugs should be used cautiously in moderate renal dysfunction, and they are to be avoided in patients with severe renal dysfunction because of the increased risk of hyperkalemia. Okay, so first drug in that, it is aldosterone antagonist, and the mechanism of action of it, as per the name suggests, it blocks the action of aldosterone onto the aldosterone receptor. Okay, so the drugs which are there under this aldosterone antagonist are spironolactone and eplerenone, and these are the synthetic steroids which antagonize the aldosterone receptor. So these aldosterone receptors, when they are blocked, it prevents translocation of the receptor complex into the nucleus of the target cell, and thus it ultimately results into lack of intracellular proteins which stimulate sodium potassium exchange sites of the collecting tubule. Okay, so this aldosterone antagonist, it prevents sodium reabsorption, and also potassium and hydrogen secretion is also inhibited because of it. So eplerenone is more selective for aldosterone receptor, and thus it causes less endocrine effects when we compare it with that of the spironolactone. And what endocrine effects we are talking about? That is gynecomastia. It is creation or production of breast like structure in males. Okay, so this spironolactone, it is non-specific in its action. That's why it has the problems related to the progesterone and the androgen receptors. Okay, so actions of these drugs, they antagonize the aldosterone receptor at renal site, which causes diuresis, and non-renal sites, which causes other effects. So in most edematous states, the blood levels of the aldosterone, they are high, which causes retention of the sodium. So the spironolactone, it antagonizes the activity of aldosterone, and thus it results in the retention of the potassium and excretion of the sodium. So therapeutic uses, the first one is the edema. So aldosterone antagonists, they are particularly effective diuretics when used in high doses for edema associated with secondary hyperaldosteronism. Okay, so such as hepatic cirrhosis and nephrotic syndrome. Okay, so it is said that there is secondary hyperaldosteronism. So secondary means what? There is some primary disease which is leading to the hyperaldosteronism. So which is the primary disease over here? It is hepatic cirrhosis and the nephrotic syndrome, which is leading to the hyperaldosteronism. Okay, so then we have a spironolactone is diuretic of choice in patient with hepatic cirrhosis with fluid in the peritoneal cavity, and this condition where the fluid accumulates in the peritoneal cavity, it is called as ascites. मराठीमध्ये त्याला जलोदर असं म्हणतात. Okay, so by contrast, in patients who have no significant circulating levels of aldosterone, there is minimal diuretic effect with use of this drug. Okay, so what is the condition for which this drug can be utilized is that there has to be increased circulating levels of aldosterone. Otherwise, this drug won't be of use. Okay. The next is hypokalemia. That's why they are called as potassium sparing diuretics. Although aldosterone antagonists, they have low efficacy in mobilizing sodium from the body in comparison with other diuretics, they have the useful property of causing retention of potassium. These agents are often given in conjunction. Conjunction means in uh, along with the thiazide and loop diuretics, which are known to uh, cause the potassium excretion and causing the hypokalemic, and they prevent the potassium excretion which occurs with these diuretics. Okay, so next therapeutic use is the heart failure. Aldosterone antagonists, they are employed at lower doses to prevent myocardial remodeling, which is mediated by aldosterone. Okay, so we have already seen about this myocardial remodeling, what it is. So it is like a renovation that takes place in the heart wall. The heart wall becomes thicker in nature. The number of muscle fibers, they increase in order to compensate the loss of cardiac output. Okay, so use of these agents, they have been shown to decrease mortality associated with the heart failure, particularly in those with reduced ejection fraction. Okay, so next is resistant hypertension. These drugs, they are also used in this condition. And what is the resistant hypertension? It is defined by use of 3 or more medication without reaching the blood pressure goal, often responds well to the aldosterone antagonist. So what it means is that when we have tried all the other drugs, first line drugs, second line drugs, and third line drugs, still there is no achievement in the blood pressure goals, that we are not able to bring that elevated blood pressure to the normal level. So in that condition, these drugs are quite helpful. So this effect, it can be seen in those with or without elevated aldosterone levels. Okay, so next is polycystic ovary syndrome. So the spironolactone is often used off-label for the treatment of polycystic ovary syndrome, that is PCOS. Okay, so off-label, what is off-label? There are some on-label indication and there are some off-label indication. On-label means what? Certain drugs, they are known that they are to be used for this particular clinical condition, but in some other condition also they are being used, they are being utilized even though they are not recommended for that particular purpose. Okay, so such use of these drugs, it is off label. That means it is not recommended anywhere that these drugs are to be used for this purpose, but still they are being used. Okay, so it blocks androgen receptors and it inhibits steroid synthesis at high doses, and thereby it helps to offset increased androgen levels which are seen in these disorders. So see, only the spironolactone it is being used. Why? Because its action is non-specific. Okay, and also it is not much of any use if the aldosterone levels are not elevated, but still it will block the androgen receptor which are present in the gonads. Okay, so next, pharmacokinetics, the spironolactone and the eplerenone, they are well absorbed after oral administration. The spironolactone is extensively metabolized and is converted to several active metabolites which contribute to the therapeutic effect of it. Eplerenone, it is metabolized by the enzyme that is CYP3A4, the most common enzyme. Okay, so the adverse effect they include, first one is the hyperkalemia and second one is the gynecomastia. So the gynecomastia, it is associated with only spironolactone because of its non-specificity. So hyperkalemia, Why hyperkalemia? Because it reduces or inhibits the excretion of the potassium. The potassium remains in the blood and thus it leads to the hyperkalemia. So it becomes mandatory for carrying out or monitoring the potassium levels again and again. Okay. So next drugs, a very small point, that is renal epithelial sodium channel inhibitors. The examples we have, that is triamterene and the amiloride. So these drugs, they block epithelial sodium channels and thus they result in decrease in sodium potassium exchange. Although they have potassium sparing diuretic action similar to that of the aldosterone antagonist, their ability to block the sodium potassium exchange site in the collecting tubule does not depend on the presence of aldosterone. Okay, so the aldosterone antagonist, their activity is more dependent on the elevated levels of aldosterone, but these drugs, they have no such prerequisite for their action. Okay, so like aldosterone antagonists, these agents, they are not very efficacious diuretics. Both triamterene and amiloride, they are commonly used in combination with other diuretics almost solely for their potassium sparing properties. So we have to combine these drugs with the loop diuretics or the thiazide diuretics. Okay. So next is the carbonic anhydrase inhibitor. So this carbonic anhydrase enzyme, you have to remember what function it plays, is that it is present in the tubular cells of the PCT, that is proximal convoluted tubule, and this enzyme, it carries out the reaction, that is H2O plus CO2 in presence of carbonic anhydrase gives the H2CO3, and this H2CO3, it breaks down into the H plus ion and the HCO3 minus ion. So this H plus ion, it is transported outside the cell into the lumen, and in exchange of this H plus, the sodium is carried inside the cell and then into the interstitium. So if we inhibit this particular enzyme, that is carbonic anhydrase enzyme, then there will be reduction in the hydrogen which is available for the transport or for the exchange against the sodium, and that's how the sodium transport across the proximal tubule cell membrane is inhibited, and thereby it acts as a diuretic. Okay, so also it doesn't only cause loss of the hydrogen, it also causes loss of the bicarbonate ion. Okay, so this bicarbonate ion, it is retained in the lumen with marked elevation in the urinary pH. Okay, so as it is alkaline in nature, the urinary pH becomes alkaline. Okay, so the loss of this bicarbonate via urine, it causes hyperchloremic metabolic acidosis. Okay, so if you remember the buffer systems of our body, this bicarbonate ion, it plays a very important role in that. So if excess of bicarbonate is lost through the urine, it causes this hyperchloremic metabolic acidosis. Okay, so the therapeutic uses, we have the therapeutic use which is altogether a different use, that is in case of glaucoma. So you have studied glaucoma, there is increase in intraocular pressure, and the oral acetazolamide, it decreases production of aqueous humor, and thus it reduces the intraocular pressure in patients with chronic open angle glaucoma, and probably by blocking carbonic anhydrase in the ciliary body of the eye. So don't think that the carbonic anhydrase, it is only present in the cells of the PCT, but it is also present in the ciliary body of the eye. Okay, So the topical carbonic anhydrase inhibitors such as dorzolamide and brinzolamide, they have advantage of not causing systemic effects. Okay. Then we have the altitude sickness. Altitude sickness is that when you move from the like sea level, we are now almost at the sea level, and if you move at higher altitudes, like if you go to the Himalayas, okay, so some in some people it causes sickness. Okay, so in such condition we have to use this drug, that is acetazolamide. So it can be used as a prophylactic measure for the symptoms of altitude sickness. Okay, so acetazolamide, it prevents weakness, breathlessness, then dizziness, nausea, and cerebral as well as pulmonary edema characteristic of the this altitude sickness syndrome. Okay, so pharmacokinetics, it can be administered orally or intravenously, and it is approximately 90% protein bound and is eliminated renally by both active tubular secretion and the passive reabsorption process. Okay, so adverse effects include metabolic acidosis, which is mild, then potassium depletion, renal stone formation, drowsiness, paresthesia may occur. So drugs should be avoided in patients with hepatic cirrhosis because it could lead to decreased excretion of the NH4 plus. Okay, so last diuretics, that is osmotic diuretics. So a number of simple hydrophilic chemical substances that are filtered through glomerulus such as mannitol, they result in the diuresis. So osmotic diuresis, they create the osmotic pressure and they cause retention of water in the tubule only, and as the inside of the tubule becomes hyperosmolar, the water doesn't leave the tubule and thus it causes the diuresis. It is that simple make of action we have over here. Okay, so filtered substances, they undergo little or no reabsorption and thus results in higher osmolarity of the tubular fluid. So they have the sole function of increasing the osmolarity of the tubular fluid, and this prevents further water reabsorption at the descending loop of Henle, then proximal convoluted tubule, and thus resulting in osmotic diuresis with little additional sodium excretion, which is called as aquaresis. Okay, so it doesn't have much effect on the sodium excretion, but it does have effect on the water excretion. That's why it is called as aquaresis. Okay, so that's why these agents, they are not useful for treating condition in which sodium retention occurs. Okay, so they are used to maintain urine flow following acute toxic ingestion of the substances capable of producing acute renal failure. So in toxicity conditions, these drugs are more preferred than the other condition. So these are the mainstay of treatment for patients with increased intracranial pressure. Okay, so the adverse effect include dehydration and extracellular water expansion from osmotic effects in the systemic circulation. The expansion of the extracellular water, it occurs because presence of mannitol in the extracellular fluid. It extracts water from the cells and causes hyponatremia until diuresis occurs. Okay, so with this we have finished with the topic, that is diuretic, and the next topic that we are going to study in tomorrow's lecture, it is antidiuretic agents. Okay, so that's all from my side. Thank you.